Okay, here we are. Good afternoon. So Nancy Henning submitted a question at 8:45 this morning, and her question was basically the Princeton plan alleviates 8% of the total funding shortfall from Indian Point. What other is the plan for the additional 92% or 23 million? The Cessation Fund will only get us through the next 8 years, after which we will face another significant, got cut off, but I imagine shortfall. Nancy is right. The district is losing through the pilot agreement with Indian Point. We're losing around $25 million, which accounts for 30% of our school budget. When we began this conversation about 4 years ago in 2017, when the plant announced its closure, we were estimating tax increases in the neighborhood of 14%. That's 14% each year for 4 years to make up the Indian Point shortfall. That got a lot of people's attention, to say the least. The difference is that we've learned a lot since Indian Point closed. For example, as Nancy mentioned, the Cessation Fund, the Power Plant Cessation Fund, is money that is provided on an application basis to school districts and communities that are impacted by a power plant closing in its school district. We did not know that. We didn't know that fund existed. We didn't even know that was an option. So the power plant, the Cessation Fund, is going to bring some revenue to the district. It's not going to be anywhere near what the Indian Point pilot was, and it's important to underscore that. The whole point and intention of the Cessation Fund is so that school districts don't have huge spikes in tax increases, such as, like I just mentioned, going from an average of a 1.04% tax increase to 14%. Right? For 10 years in a row, our average tax increase was 1.04%. I would challenge you to find a more or a lower tax increase over that duration of time in Westchester County. You won't be able to find it. So the Cessation Fund takes into account a calculation of how much revenue a school district is losing and how much revenue they were supposed to receive from the agreement. And the agreement is either the pilot agreement or if Indian Point were on the tax rolls. So again, the idea of the Cessation Fund is to allow school districts or municipalities to gradually increase taxes and not have huge spikes and not have huge reductions in terms of programs or services for students. So what else have we done? So over the last 8 to 10 years, we have tightened the belt in a number of ways. We conducted a transportation audit back in 2014 or 15, where we were able to be more efficient with our bus routing software and the number of buses we had on the road. So we were able to reduce expenses there. You'll notice that on top of our school buildings, we have solar panels. We are buying power for much cheaper than we were before. At Frank G, I keep pointing because I can see Frank G over here to my right. You'll see the parking lot lights at Frank G have little baby windmills and solar panels on them, so that we're using renewable energy sources to power the parking lot lights, and that may be a theme throughout the district. Later this spring, we're going to announce an initiative to engage with an energy performance contract, basically trying to identify how much money we could save in terms of resources we spend on power in our school district to change our lights to LED rather than some of the current lighting structures we have. If you've watched any of our board meetings this year or in the past, you'd see that we have reduced costs in terms of chaperones and athletics. Number of years ago, we streamlined some summer school programs and partnered with other districts so we could save resources that way. I think the reality is, and the gut punch is that we will never recoup every single dollar that is going out the door from Indian Point. Now, there are potential revenue sources on the horizon, and they are potential because there's a lot of work that needs to be done. For example, The governor signed on New Year's Eve a bill that we advocated for, allowing municipalities to assess spent nuclear fuel as real property. What does that mean? That means that as Indian Point goes through their decommissioning process, whatever that will look like, because we still don't know, there will be spent nuclear fuel on that campus. The governor signed a bill, so it's now law, saying that that spent nuclear fuel has a value and can be taxed. All right, so that's positive. It's positive, meaning there will be some revenue. We have no idea how much revenue that will bring in, and we have no idea when we will start to receive that revenue. Why is that? Because this law is brand new in New York State, and there are only 2 functioning nuclear power plants in New York State. Ours right now until the end of April, and the Fitzpatrick plant, which is on Lake Ontario outside of Syracuse in Oswego. So what's going against us in terms of increased revenue from Indian Point is this has never been done before. And while we can celebrate the fact that we're trailblazers and trendsetters, the issue is we have no data and we have no past practice to rely on when assessing the spent nuclear fuel and valuing that as real property. All right, there's no case law. We can't point to 1, 10, or any examples of how municipalities have assessed a tax on spent nuclear fuel in New York State. Remember, taxes are local to New York State. So who is the one that will assess the tax? It will be the town of Cortland. The town of Cortland has a tax assessor. His name is Tom Wakins. We've worked very closely with him over the last number of years with all things Indian Point. And I mean no disrespect to the town or to Tom Wakins, but this is not in their wheelhouse, the town of Cortland. It really isn't in anyone's wheelhouse to be able to assess a tax on spent nuclear fuel. Remember, the spent nuclear fuel right now under current law is that it's going to sit there. It's going to sit there until there's a law that says we can move it, but it will sit there for a really long time, and it will decompose over as many as 60 years. So what the value of spent nuclear fuel on May 1st, 2021 may be different than the value of spent nuclear fuel in 2031, 41, 51, so on and so forth. So this is brand new territory. And while there is potential and it's exciting, there really is, I would caution anyone to assume that we're going to see any immediate relief in terms of tax revenue. It's going to be a while. I would estimate at least a year or 2. Now the process, and I know I'm getting very, very specific here, but I think it's important. The process could really get dragged out because when you are assessed a tax as a homeowner or if you're a business, you have available to you an appeal process. That's called a tax certiorari. All right, and that's where you involve the courts and the legal system, and you involve judges. And if you go through a tax certiorari process, where basically you're appealing the value of your property that's been assessed, in this case by the town of Cortland, there's a proceeding. It involves lawyers, as I said, involves judges. It's very scripted. But what happens is both parties, right, the taxing party, in this case the town, and the receiver of that assessment, the business or a homeowner. If you go through the tax certiorari process, a judge will render a decision and it's full and final. So there is a risk on sort of both parties to be able to go in and go through the tax cert process, that there will be winners and losers. That's why our district many, many years ago, decades ago, and as recently as 2015. That's why we, along with the town and the village of Buchanan and Westchester County, that's why we decided to have a pilot agreement, all right? Because it was really, really hard to assess the value of Indian Point based on their unique service that they provide and the unique business that they have. So all of the parties decided to agree to a pilot. Payment in lieu of tax. Payment in lieu of tax is basically a multi-year contract that says, in this case, Indian Point is going to pay X each year in lieu of taxes, and that distribution will go to the school district, the town, the village, and even the fire department. So what that does when you have a pilot agreement, A, it's multi-year. It gives you the opportunity to plan, to have long-range planning in terms of what your expected revenues are, or if you're the business, what your expected expenses are. It keeps you out of the court system and basically the roll of the die to determine if a judge is going to agree, with the property owner or with the business. I say all of that because while the potential is there to tax the spent nuclear fuel, there is going to need to be a strategy in terms of how that is done. But before you even get to the strategy, we need really good data to determine what the value of that property is. Now, if it weren't a nuclear power plant, the argument is that property is worth a lot more money than it currently is. It's the only significant stretch, I think it's 240 acres, significant stretch of riverfront property that does not have train tracks on the shore. All right. If it were anything but a power plant, I think there would be a lot of potential development opportunities. Because it's a nuclear power plant, certainly there are environmental concerns, and there are very specific rules and regulations to follow and protocols in terms of that property moving from a nuclear power plant to a defunct nuclear power plant to being able to be divided, subdivided, and for business development. So I say all of that to answer Nancy's question a little bit, is to say there could be some financial relief on the way, but it would be irresponsible to even hazard a guess at what that would be right now. And it would be even more irresponsible to make any sort of short or long range plans based on a number that we don't know, and we don't even have a method to assume what that number could be. So there is potential revenue, but put an asterisk around that, because I think it's going to take a while before we figure out what that is and before any payments are flowing. So those are some of the areas, Nancy, where the district has been cutting, where we've been looking for additional revenue. One place that we have additional revenue today than we did 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. We have more students coming to our district paying tuition, particularly for special education programs, and that brings in revenue. That's another source of revenue to the district that we otherwise didn't expect. I'll also tell you, just as a sneak peek before tomorrow's discussion with the board, we're going to look at enrollment. Our enrollment has declined about 10% in the last 10 years. And we have a very significant enrollment gap at the middle school and at the elementary school. And we're going to look at what our current enrollment is, what our enrollment was last year, and what our projected enrollment is, because there needs to be a discussion of whether or not we need to right-size our staffing to meet a decreased demand in terms of enrollment. We do that every year with the elementary program. Every year, Margaret Roller, our executive director for curriculum instruction, looks at trend data in terms of enrollment. We look at the number of kids in each of the 3 elementary schools by grade level. We look at average class size, and we talk about some of the discrepancies because they do exist. Because right now our elementary schools are students attend elementary school based on where they live, neighborhood model. But I'll tell you that we'll share some information tomorrow with the board and the public that we're going to have class sizes as small as 13 or 14 students and as large as 27. And all of those are within our class cap limitations. So we're at the point, unfortunately, where we need to look at programs, and we need to look at the people who deliver some of those programs. We have about 3 teachers district-wide have indicated that they're going to retire as of today. I can tell you in my tenure here, 3 is more than, well, it's certainly the least amount of teachers that have indicated retiring, and I think it's half of even our lowest. I think we've had at least 6 or 7 on the low end before. More may retire. For example, at this time last year, we only had a handful of folks that indicated they want to retire, but as we went through the spring and even into the summer, as we had an idea of what returning to school would look like this past September, we had about 4 or 5 more staff members elect to retire. That could happen again this spring and into the summer, but we look at that closely. We're able to save some significant money when staff retire, and we do a close analysis of whether or not we need to replace that position, or certainly 9 times out of 10, the salary of a new or incoming staff member is typically significantly less than the outgoing staff member, especially if they retire. The third piece of this is tax increases. As I mentioned earlier, our taxes have been artificially low because of the strength of the Indian Point pilot, and I think we have said very publicly and honestly over the last number of years since Indian Point announced their closure that we have to look at some tax increases as part of creating new revenue. For 10 years in a row, our tax increase was 1.04. Last year, our tax increase was just under 6 at 5.9. And I think much to the surprise of many of us, especially me, that budget passed last June at a 2-to-1 margin. And I certainly didn't anticipate that. So we don't believe that sustainable tax increases in the neighborhood of 6, 7, or 8% will fly with our community, especially since more than half of our community do not currently or never did have students in our district. So there's an expectation that taxes, remain affordable for our families, especially those, as I said, that don't have kids or those that are aging in place and have lived here for decades and have retired here or wish to stay. So there is a healthy tension out there in the community. And the last time one of our budgets failed was not good news. We reduced about 35 staff members, and it took about 8 years to recoup all of those positions back into our budget. So the Board of Education wants to be very deliberate, want to make sure that we're not making reductions that are short-sighted, but the reality of the fact that Indian Point and 30% of our budget is leaving, that we have to have a conversation about where we can reduce our expenses and where we can reduce or increase revenue in terms of tax increases. So that's a really long answer, but I tried to touch on a number of topics that I know have come up in other discussions. So I hope, Nancy, you found that helpful. Since that was the only question submitted for today, if anyone else wants to chime in with any of their questions, if you want to raise your hand, I'll try to maneuver the screen here so I can see as many people as possible. You're welcome, Nancy. I hope that helped. Any questions from anyone? Whoa. All right. Are we sure we don't have any more questions? This is the second of 6 community-wide meetings we're holding over the next week or so, and also 4 PTA meetings. So if you're a member of any PTA, make sure you pay attention to your emails because I'm going on tour with PTAs. Wendy has a question. What programs to help the children transition to this new model are under consideration? Okay, so transitioning if we decide to move to the Princeton plan. Great question, Wendy. So part of our discovery in early January was included members of our stakeholder committee had a series of conversations with 3 local school districts that are in the Princeton plan: Somers, Ossining, and Terrytown. Now there are other school districts. There are plenty of other school districts that are in the Princeton plan or a version of it that we did not talk to, and that was because their demographics were nowhere near close to ours. Those districts include Peekskill. Those districts include Byram Hills is in a Princeton plan. Yorktown has sort of a modified Princeton plan, but we decided to move forward with communicating with, as I said, Somers, Ossining, and Tarrytown. Our stakeholder committee that included many staff, parents, and community members talked about this exact topic with staff and parents and PTA members from those 3 districts I mentioned. And we got a lot of good information in terms of tips and suggestions, how to get kids ready for the transition. And I won't tell you everything they said, but they gave 2 salient points. One is that they found no significant evidence that kids were struggling with the transitions. Obviously, in a Princeton plan, kids move schools more frequently, and that is usually a cause for concern. But what all 3 of those districts shared is that they have systems in place to assist with those transitions. And the second thing is those kids are moving by grade level. So hundreds of kids are moving from one grade to the next. That the transition to a new school is not as daunting when you're going with 200 of your friends. But some of the tactics and some of the recommended activities included the principal from the new school comes down and meets with kids and hosts town halls, that the PTAs from both schools get together and have social events with families and kids. The kids, let's say from the 3rd grade school, spend some time in the spring trips and touring the 4th and 5th grade school and meeting their potential teachers or school counselor or principal. So a lot of hands-on activities, a lot of opportunity to put your feet in the new school and meet and greets. Those districts have been in the Princeton plan for a good long time, and they've been able to perfect some of those systems. But they shared that, of course, certain times kids struggle with transitions just like ours do, and that they have a whole host of staff and specialists that can work with those students and families, whether it's a school counselor or social worker, you name it. We have similar staff. Lisa Shookman was on the call, but she had the scoop because she had a PPS meeting. But she and her team have been working on this and talking about some of the triggers and how to alleviate some of those. So while it's certainly a daunting task, what all 3 of those districts also told us to a T is that typically it's the parents that are more concerned about the transition than the students. The kids are successful, and as I said, they're moving with huge numbers of good friends, and that it really isn't that big of a deal. So I hope that provides some insight to you, Wendy. Another question, don't you think kids will get lost in such big classroom sizes? Are classes going to have a TA for them to help? The reality is, let's go back to last year. Our average class size in our elementary school last year was 19.2. The average class size in the proposed Princeton plan, depending on what grade you're in, will be around 21. So while I say 19.2, that's the law of averages. And which means for every class size that we had of 13, which we have had and which we do, that's offset by a class size of 25, which we have had and which we do. Next year, without the Princeton plan, we're looking at there are class sizes of 27, 23, another 23, 22, 20. We have always had class sizes in that range. The issue is when you have law of averages, as I said, you will have a class size in one school, let's say, and I think this was last year, maybe Margaret will know, it was either last year or 2 years ago, one school had a kindergarten size of 13, and another school in the exact same grade level had a kindergarten size of 23, all right? Huge difference. And one of the issues that we have in the current model is our class sizes are 100% contingent on which students live in which neighborhood at what time that need to go to school for what grade level. For example, next year, there's a 5th grade section with 26 kids in it, and another 5th grade section in a different school, but same grade level, has 19. So we've always had some situations where we had big class sizes. The potential move to the Princeton plan will alleviate those huge swings, because you'll have 8, 9, or 10 teachers in the same place at the same time teaching the same grade. You can spread kids out and distribute them more equitably across more teachers than, for example, next year Furnace Woods will only have 1 5th grade section, only one. And in many cases, Furnace Woods and BV would have only 2 teachers per section. So it sort of becomes a luck of the draw in order to determine what class size will be, because we can't control for that. If all the kids are in the same place at the same time, going to the same school by grade level, if we have big increases in enrollment, we can spread those increases out more equitably over those teachers. So I hope that helps. Rebecca said, I found it cumbersome to find the meeting link. We're hearing from the community. They are not aware these meetings are happening. Can there be a press release pinned to the top? Sure. Every day, I don't know, Rebecca, if you heard me earlier, but every day we post the website link and the phone number to dial in, because it's unique to each day's meeting. So we've put it out in a press release on our website. We've put it out, I believe, on Facebook. We're trying to communicate with everyone we can about these meetings. So hopefully people are paying attention or going to our website. One of the challenges is that we don't have email addresses for those community members that aren't families. We did put out a big push about a week ago to try to do that, but trying to reach out to as many as we can. Sarah has a question. I'm curious about bus rides, length of time kids will be on them. Interested in the thoughts regarding making this change during COVID, more exposure possibly. Let's see, Cub Scout leader, this will be a huge change as we serve mainly Furnace Woods K through 5. All right, so bus rides, yes. When you have further to go from your pickup to your school, bus rides will increase. Couple things that have to take place before we start running bus routes. One is to pick the schools that would house each of the grade levels, and there are pros and cons to each school being either of the 3 situations, right? K1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But as a rule of thumb, right now, the average bus ride from the Furnace Woods area over to the high school for high school kids, average ride is 35 minutes. There's a short ride of 30 and the longest ride of 40. Depending on where you live, however, and depending on what grade level will be going to either Frank G or going to BV, those bus times will change because it depends on what route you go. And I think one of the challenges with the Furnace Woods area is Furnace Woods as a footprint in terms of square mileage. Furnace Woods is larger than the 2 other neighborhood elementary schools, and Furnace Woods has significantly less students. For example, we're estimating right now that Furnace Woods will only have 204 students, which represents about a quarter of all elementary students. So when you have the largest space with the fewest number of students that need a bus, even if the bus is just going to Furnace Woods, those bus rides are going to be longer because there's more space to cover. But a rule of thumb is that going from the Furnace Woods area over to this west side of the district, average bus ride is 35 minutes. And if you live in the BV area and you're going to the middle school, your bus ride is around 35.5 minutes. The shortest bus ride is 31 minutes and the longest is 41 minutes. So we use those as pretty good estimates because Furnace Woods, is in the backyard of the middle school or vice versa. The other thing we would need to do in order to really drill down in terms of bus routes is we need to know which school everyone's going to. And the reason that's important is because our transportation system is dynamic, meaning it responds to real-time data. That's why, for those of you who have had students in elementary school for a while, that's why sometimes your bus pickup or drop-off spot changes. That's why your bus pickup or drop-off time changes. The kids on the bus change because we use a real-time software to determine the most efficient and effective way to pick students up and get them to school. So we would use that software as we always do. After we input which students are going to which school, we hit the magic button and the transportation software gives us our first draft of bus routes. And then our transportation director and her team go into them and drill down to some of the specific issues. For example, we do have neighborhoods and streets that big buses cannot go down or can't turn around. So sometimes we send a small bus or a van, those sort of instances. But in terms of bus runs, that's big picture what we're looking at in terms of time. You mentioned COVID. Should we make the change during COVID? That has been, I think, one of the more consistent pieces of feedback we've heard over the last number of weeks, is that we're in the middle of a pandemic. We don't know what the spring will look like, let alone next year. And shouldn't we consider implementing the Princeton plan in September of 22, for example, since we just don't have enough information about next fall. So that is a consideration and a comment that has been echoed very consistently and loudly over the last number of weeks. So certainly that is going to be taken into consideration. You mentioned Cub Scout leaders. Cub Scout, there'll be a huge change. We currently serve Furnace Woods. Yeah, we would need to talk with Cub Scout leaders about that. You could still have, your neighborhood pack, however you're divided geographically. May not need to be by grade level. To be honest, I don't know enough about Scouts to say that with authority, but certainly we'd be able to work with you and the Cub Scouts of America in order to make that, or Boy Scouts of America in order to make that work. We're also having conversations with childcare providers, specifically Mother Connection. We know that that's been a concern. So they are in the loop, and we have agreed to work with them in terms of looking at transportation support. For example, if I live in BV and I have three kids and they end up going to 3 different schools, can they receive before or after school care at BV regardless of what grade level their kids are in? And we certainly, that would make sense. That would be simple, and certainly would be something we take under consideration and then try to transport kids to the appropriate school. So we know that there'll be some fine-tuning we'll need to do on some of those areas, but I hope that helps. Nancy has another question. Schools haven't been chosen brings up another question. Is September truly and honestly feasible consideration? Logistics seem impossible to coordinate in less than 6 months. Yes and no. We have begun discussing with the teachers union in terms of how teachers would be assigned to potentially new schools, and in fact that's an easy conversation because the teacher's contract clearly outlines that method of how those decisions would be made. It's very clear, very sequential, so we would be able to identify a lot of those things pretty quickly. Our facilities director, Anthony Merlini, is reviewing some of the considerations in terms of what school would be most appropriate for which grade level. He also believes that the physical task of moving classrooms and equipment would not be or would be possible from he and his team over the summer. Remember, throughout our district, each summer, every classroom basically gets emptied. So we're cleaning out classrooms every summer anyway to do a deep clean in those spaces. So packing up and moving certain teachers from school A to school B, we almost do that every year in terms of we pack their things up and move them to the hallway or the gymnasium or auditorium so the school can be deep cleaned. So we don't have any concerns there. Really, the concern is whether or not families and children will feel that they're ready, and whether or not things start to open up or loosen up in terms of the pandemic and what schooling looks like in the pandemic. But I hope that helps. Another question: why are we in such a rush for September? We're not even out of the pandemic, trying to make other changes. We talked about that. I think one of the issues regarding why this is even still a conversation for right now is because our finances aren't changing. The reduction in pilot doesn't care about the pandemic and doesn't care about our deliberations and conversations about potentially implementing the Princeton plan. And the difference between a budget with the Princeton plan and a budget without the Princeton plan is pretty significant. And the difference is about $2 million. And $2 million in terms of a tax calculation is around 4.5%. So if the school district raised taxes 4.5%, we would bring in $2 million of additional revenue. All right. So if you look at this backwards and look at it as tax avoidance, that if the Princeton plan was vetted and we said, no, we're not going to do the Princeton plan, we would need basically an additional $2 million to keep the system, the elementary system, the way it is. $2 million of revenue is a tax increase of 4.5%. So you can look at it as an increase or tax avoidance. That tax avoidance and that $2 million figure, and the fact that this is year 2 of reduced pilot agreement, is not changing because of the pandemic. So the financial urgency is still there. I think the discussion that we need to have is whether or not the timing is right, and are there other potential opportunities to try to reduce a large tax increase to something more manageable that we believe the community will support. And that will be a conversation that the Board of Education has been having and will continue to have each of the next handful of Wednesdays as we finish up and deliberate on the budget. But that's a good question. Let's see, Michelle Piccolo Hill, sorry to jump off, I need to run. Oh, okay, Michelle, thank you. Francis, if your busing management software can easily give models for you, you can use the current residence data and school grades to give you a model. I get that's a question. I understand you haven't named which school. Excuse me. Perhaps this could alleviate mystery of the times. Well, kind of. What we don't have is we don't have all of our kindergartners registered for next year. And in fact, looking at the number of kindergartners we have registered for next year, I'd say we probably have around 33% or 40% of them registered. So that's a big piece. We're talking about 100 students that are not yet on our radar that we would need to put into the transportation system. And then also we have to take out 5th graders, right? Because 5th graders are graduating and they go into a different middle school system. So we're not quite able to estimate that, because 100 students in kindergarten is significant. 100 kindergartners is going to represent about 66, about 2/3 of the entire grade level right there. So, you know, any modeling with that number of potential discrepancies, I think would not give us the greatest data for us to even start brainstorming. But good suggestion, but I wanted to let you know, Francis, that was considered. Erica, who determines who stays and who goes with the teacher? Aren't many items still in boxes? Do they need to be unpacked and repacked? When will staff do this? Is there a schedule? When do we anticipate teachers, principals being assigned? Well, they'll be assigned after a decision's made, and the process of deciding the teachers, as I said, is actually very, very simple. It goes by their seniority and their current grade level. And then after they are placed in their new school, there's always an opportunity for them to ask for a transfer to a different grade level. In terms of packing up, yes, many things are in boxes, so they might not need to be repacked or unpacked. In terms of a timeline, we would probably need to look at the end of the school year. Or providing time for teachers to pack over the summer. But they do, you know, we do provide time for that when teachers do move from school A to school B on the occasion. They are given some time, and we would have to work that into probably end of year schedule. And that would be, you know, regardless of what year we would potentially implement the Princeton plan. If our staff feel that they need time to make decisions on what stays or what goes, we'll need to work that into the end of the year, whether that would be this June or June of next year, should we implement the Princeton plan in 22. Let's see, Sarah, $2 million revenue each year, correct. For every year, Sarah, that we, how can I say this? For every year, let's say we implement the Princeton plan, right? And we do it for 10 years. We would be expensing at least $2 million less a year than we would if we didn't implement the Princeton plan. And that $2 million would grow by, various factors, cost of living adjustment or inflation, so on and so forth. So it wouldn't be a hard $2 million each year, but it would be a reduction. If we compared a budget over 10 years, a budget with the Princeton plan and without, you would see at least a $2 million reduction in expenses on the Princeton plan budget. Sped, will there be Sped services in each school? Yes. And again, if Lisa Shookman were here, she would tell you that. Sped, special education programs and services, go with the child. So whatever school your child is in and whatever services they need, we have a legal obligation to provide them, and all of those services would take place in that child's school, whether it's the 4 or 5 school, 2, 3, or K1. Could those high kindergarten numbers throw the Princeton plan modeling we've done out the window? Not really, Nancy, because what we did, and I'll let Margaret Roller weigh in on this a little bit, what we did for the modeling is we used last year's numbers, or I'm sorry, current year's numbers. So currently we have, let's see, 125 plus 25. We have well, plus 26, 151 kindergartners. Right now, as of today, we have 53 and 17. So what's that, 70? So we have 70 of about 150 that are currently registered. And Margaret, I don't know if you want to weigh in a little bit on that.
In the modeling that we've done so far, and it changes a little bit because numbers are always going up or down even during the school year, you're spreading those kids across 7 or 8 sections, so you get more balanced classes. And we're shooting right now, I think the last projection we did for Princeton plan is about 19 kindergartners in a class. Our cap right now with board policy is 22. I'm not going to lie, I'm an early childhood person, so I always want fewer in K1 than not. And we would definitely have that by having the ability to balance them out across a number of sections.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments anyone would like to make? Okay, I heard a ding. Mary, you raised your hand. If you want to come off mute, Mary.
Hi, yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm driving, so I can't figure out if I wanted to how to chat to the chat box. I'm just curious. I know about the Princeton model, but I'm just curious as to other models that might have been looked at. I know I did read through a lot of information that saw like a K-3 building and status quo. Has a model been explored, for example, of a magnet school or a parent choice school, where schools would remain K-5 schools, but families would have an opportunity to sort of pick their first choice or their second choice, and then students could be bused throughout the district, but possibly siblings may be able to stay in a building together?
Good question. You're correct in that you probably read an 84-page report that came out in November of 19 that talked about different models that were explored. And the reality is we had the status quo, right? Our current model, we had the Princeton plan, and then there were some other creative models. Some of them called for closing schools, some of them called for 5th graders going to the middle school. For a number of reasons, those models were not pursued. Those reasons included closing a school is really 2 feet in cement. I mean, you are making a long-term decision when you close a school. some believe that when our district, and I don't even know when we closed McKinley School, but that was a mistake, and that really it's advised against closing schools because that's an asset that the community and the taxpayers have invested in over a long period of time. The other models called for, I think, 2 schools that were K-2, and then 1 school that was 3-5, 5th graders going to the middle school. The potential savings after that model was run in terms of staffing were not significant enough. They weren't worth the the headache of exploring and even potentially implementing. So they were rejected by the board back in, I think it was January of 2020, so a little over a year ago, because the savings just weren't there. In terms of a magnet school or sort of a specialty school, I think the issue is that the reality is we're a district of some significant declining enrollment. And what happens is when you have specialty schools, or let's not even say they're specialty schools, when you have schools with small enrollment, and I'll use Furnace Woods as an example. Furnace Woods has about 200 kids. It's really difficult to staff those schools because you have huge disparities in class size. For example, and again, you'll see this tomorrow, Furnace Woods, we're estimating 27 kids in 5th grade next year because those are all the 5th graders that live in that attendance zone. We're projecting in upwards of 20 plus in 1st grade. That will be more than the 2 other schools in 1st grade. Now, there have been years when Furnace Woods had lower class size and the other 2 had significantly larger. So the issue is you really don't have the opportunity to experience the efficiencies when you have so few kids in the same place at the same time requiring the same program. So I hope that helps. Another question regarding school start time. Changes school start time may mess things up for work. I will have to look at daycare. My kids start at 8:20. I know other schools start at 9. Yeah, and we may need to have staggered start times for a number of reasons. One, for transportation purposes, but also for family reasons. There will be families that may have students in at least 2 elementary schools, and to be able, if you like to drive your child or pick them up, we very likely may need to stagger the beginning or end time of those elementary schools. Those are going to be looked at in conjunction with the transportation model. Because we try to be as efficient as we can with our buses. We try to use the same buses multiple times throughout the day so that we don't have too many buses driving too few miles, right? We want to be as efficient as possible and get our greatest bang for our buck with our transportation system. So as of now, there is no projected change in start time. And in fact, the staggered start and end time from the input we heard will only help parents. And that's the input we heard when we had these similar conversations with those 3 other districts I mentioned. All right. Okay, folks, any other thoughts or questions? You can raise your hand. You can put it in the chat. Has the transportation model of busing from different areas to the 3 schools been considered? I'm not sure, Nancy, I understand what you're asking. If you want to come off mute and describe it a little bit more for me. If you're there. It's transportation. Different areas. Yeah, I'm not. Oh, okay. Nancy's trying to come off mute. According to us, you're off mute, Nancy. Well, might be having audio problems. All right, let me go to some others. We'll see if Nancy can get her audio figured out. Patrice, assuming we go to the Princeton plan with 2 grade levels housed together at Furnace Woods, what happens if a large majority of the retired folks who live in our district move away as taxes go up, young families move in, we end up with too many students to fit? Yes, so we looked at this. We looked at the number of classrooms in all 3 elementary schools, and we looked at the projected number of classrooms we would need in the Princeton plan. And I'm happy to report that regardless of which grade levels go to which school, we would have a very significant excess of extra classrooms that we would be able to account for multiple sections of students moving in if we needed more classrooms. So that certainly was a concern we had, and said, oh my goodness, what if we have an enrollment blast off? All of the schools, I think that the largest school in the Princeton plan only needed, I think 15 or 16 classrooms. The smallest one only needed 13. So there's plenty of leftover space if we need to expand. That's not always the case in our current model. For example, we got pretty dangerously close a couple years ago at Frank G. Lindsay. We're running out of classroom spaces, and we had to refurbish some spaces that were used for non-instructional purposes to retrofit them for classrooms. So it sometimes works in the opposite as well. Nancy, I thought I heard you come off mute. You want to try again?
Does this work now?
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, hey, sorry. It was like on my microphone and my keyboard or something very strange like that. Apologies. I know I didn't explain it while I was trying to type very quickly, but what I was wondering about is, so I live kind of more on the Furnace Wood side of town, and what I was kind of wondering if it was considered as a transportation model, because I know one of the major concerns that families have is for working parents especially, multiple pickup times. Like if you have a 45-minute gap between your elementary children getting on the bus, that could be very cumbersome. Has it been considered having maybe a bus route that comes from, let's say, this area, picks up all the elementary children that makes sense in a sensible route, does a stop at Furnace Woods, stop at FGL, stop at BV, and then kind of course, similar on all sides, but that kind of consolidation?
Yeah, great question. And in fact, that is exactly what our transportation supervisor will be working on with one of our long-time transportation consultants that helps us with some of these special projects. So that is exactly one of many potential systems that we would put in place, because so many kids, look, our district boundaries, our elementary boundaries are literally a street. Kids on one side of the street go to school A and the other side go to school B. So if it makes sense to have one bus swing through and bring kids from multiple areas to one school, or drop off at school A, like you mentioned, at 8:20 and they get to school B at 8:30, those are the exact efficiencies that we will be looking for to determine how efficiently we can transport kids. So thanks. I'm glad you were able to clarify. Sarah said, thank you. Really hoping that 21 next school year will remain as is until we get COVID vaccines. Yes, we are trying to get vaccinated as quickly as possible. That is certainly a big deal and part of the governor and county executive's reopening plan. Patrice. Okay, I answered that. Dave, okay, Dave, lending my support for the Princeton plan this upcoming year. Kids have not had a normal year, so don't bother going back to normal and changing again. We've heard that too. We're all out of sorts, so this may not be a bad time to make that change. Make the uproar worth it, the cost savings and equity for students. I know you're the minority. We've heard that, Dave, so you're not in the minority. But we certainly have had families weigh in to say this is not a normal year, and kids are more resilient perhaps than we know, and some folks have thought this is as good a time as any for a change. But certainly, it's about readiness, and that's we had said in a different meeting, there's two levels of readiness. There's kids and whether or not they're ready, and then the rest of us, whether or not we're ready. What we heard from those 3 school districts that we spent considerable amount of time with is that, again, barring very specific instances where the transitions or the transition didn't go well, that they reported consistently that their transitions were smooth and that kids adjusted effectively, and there were no issues. So certainly we'll take that into consideration. The younger kids need bathrooms in classrooms. Are there enough as of now to accommodate? That's not a regulation. That's sort of, I don't know. People think that every classroom must have a bathroom. That's not true. But we can tell you that whatever school would house kindergarten, every kindergarten classroom would have their own bathroom. And maybe, depending on the number of first grade sections, maybe every first grade classroom would have a bathroom. Many of our schools have bathrooms in the classroom, some don't. For example, what's currently known as the 4th and 5th grade wing at Furnace Woods, those classrooms do not have bathrooms in them, but in that hallway they have boys and girls bathroom space. So that certainly is under consideration as well. So thanks for bringing that up. Okay, we are at 1 hour. Any other last second questions or thoughts? If you think of some, please register your question on our little Google form. I'm looking at it now. We do, obviously, we read them and try to answer those questions at the onset of each meeting. And as we did today, get into a Q&A however you wish, whether through the chat function or coming off mute. So we have more of these scheduled. Tonight at 7 o'clock, I'll be speaking at the Furnace Woods PTA meeting briefly. And I say briefly because then at 8 o'clock, I'll be speaking with a joint PTA meeting between the middle school and the high school. But our schedule of these meetings are up on our website. And again, each morning we'll publish the link or the phone number to dial in because each day that link and phone number changes. So just hop onto our website. It's right there as the first news item of the day, front and center on our homepage. All right. Oh, thanks, Sarah. Does not envy our position. Oh, thank you. Well, thank you, Sarah. Yes, we're having some difficult conversations these days in our school community, but necessary. So I appreciate that. All right, everyone. Thanks for your time. I'm going to stop recording and then end the call. So we'll see you again, hopefully. But if you have any questions, again, feel free to put them on that Google form, or if you want to email me, or we'll see you at a future meeting. Thanks, everyone.